Hello, this is Michael Weidman, recording my final presentation for Bible 151, Acts, the Holy Spirit at Work in the Life of the Believer. The book of Acts was most likely written by Luke, the same author who wrote the Gospel of Luke. The books are connected, both in their structure and style, as well as their introductions, which are both addressed to a Theophilus, and are further connected. The introduction to Acts links it almost directly as a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts begin and end with the same event, the ascension of Jesus into heaven and his parting words with the disciples. The book of Acts was most likely written before 70 AD. The book ends very abruptly with Paul still in prison. One would expect that Luke would record how the imprisonment and trial went, or the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem at 70 AD. However, because Luke records that Paul was imprisoned for 2 full years, some have debated that Luke did know the ending, but chose instead to end the book in that way. So the question is still up for debate. The book of Acts is typically called the Acts of the Apostles, but because of the great attention given to the Holy Spirit, his work in and through the apostles, and his direct guidance throughout the course of the book, some have decided to call it instead the Acts of the Holy Spirit through the apostles. An outline of the book of Acts is given in chapter 1, verse 8. Jesus speaks to his apostles. One of his parting words, he says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." That gives a pretty neat summary of all of the events of the book of Acts. In chapter 2, the Holy Spirit comes on the apostles and all those gathered in the upper room. They evangelize in Judea. When Stephen is martyred, the church in Jerusalem scatters, and the message goes out to Judea and Samaria. And then the narrative shifts to Paul and his missionary journeys, where he takes the gospel to the end of the earth, eventually to Rome, proverbially the end of the earth, the seat of Gentile power in that time. The book focuses on 2 main characters, primarily Peter, and then it switches to Paul. Peter carries the story through the first 15 or so chapters. He provides the primary hinge in chapter 10, bringing the gospel to Cornelius. Now this is a major part of the book, where the gospel shifts from just being for the Jews to being for the Gentiles also. This provides the impetus for Paul's first missionary journey, as the narrative begins to shift and focus more on him. And finally, it all comes to the head, almost in the center of the book, at the Council of Jerusalem, where they all decide that the gospel can be for the Gentiles, and they don't have to convert to Judaism first. Then Peter falls almost entirely out of the picture, and the story focuses on his 2 final missionary journeys, and the last approximately third of the book focuses on Paul's imprisonment at Caesarea, several speeches that he gives in appeal, and then finally his trip to Rome, thus completing the general outline of the book laid out in Acts 1:8. The book of Acts lays out for believers the early gospel that the apostles preached to their neighbors, to Jews and to Gentiles, as the message spread throughout the world. It also gives a wonderful picture of how the Holy Spirit interacts with and guides his church, building it and doing signs and wonders through the apostles and prophets, both to encourage believers and to bring the gospel to the unreached. Some have contended that the book of Acts should not be treated as doctrine, but instead should be taken as a simple historical account of what happened to the church, thus linking the Gospels with the epistles and not kind of shaking the reader all around with such a jump in time and situation. I, however, would disagree with this, believing the book of Acts to be fully taken as doctrine and inspired by the Holy Spirit for our edification and teaching.